At 75, King Charles finds himself broken by words he never expected to hear from his own brother. For decades, silence covered the deepest wounds of the royal family, shielding the crown from truths too painful to confront. But now Prince Edward has shattered that silence with a revelation about Diana that shakes the monarchy to its core. In his calm yet piercing voice, Edward recalls what Diana confided, what she endured, and what Charles ignored. The king, once stoic, is left in tears before the nation, his reign shadowed by grief and regret. This is not just a story of royalty, but of betrayal, guilt, and a brother's truth that cannot be buried any longer. The tearful king. The camera lingers on the figure of King Charles, a man who has carried the weight of crown and country for a lifetime. At 75 years of age, he appears regal, his posture straight and his attire immaculate. Yet there is no mistaking the weariness etched into his face. The lines across his brow speak of burdens borne for decades, burdens of duty, expectation, and choices that history has never allowed him to escape. The image is striking not because of the grandeur of the throne, but because of the vulnerability that creeps through in a rare and unscripted moment. As the film opens, the atmosphere is heavy with silence. Courtiers and staff watch with unease as the king, usually composed in public, falters before their eyes. His voice breaks as he speaks, his gaze falling away from the cameras that surround him. For the first time in many years, the world sees Charles not only as a monarch, but as a man haunted by memory. His eyes, glistening with tears, betray emotions too raw to be contained by the carefully maintained walls of protocol. The narration weaves through the scene with solemn gravity. It speaks of the silence that has cloaked the story of Diana for so long, a silence that preserved the image of the monarchy, yet buried the cries of a woman who once stood at its center. That silence, we are told, has now been shattered by a voice the public did not expect. Prince Edward, the quiet and often overlooked brother, has finally chosen to speak. His words do not simply recall the past, they cut into it with the precision of memory, forcing Charles to confront wounds that never healed. The film lingers on Charles's reaction. His tears are not the tears of ceremonial grief, but of a man undone by the truth that has been laid bare. It is a truth that pierces the soul because it comes not from political adversaries nor from the relentless press, but from his own blood. A brother who watched, who listened, and who has now decided that silence can no longer serve loyalty. The narrative frames this as a turning point, the moment when the king can no longer hide behind the walls of Windsor or Buckingham. Edward's revelation has drawn him into the light, exposing not just the memory of Diana, but the choices, denials, and regrets that accompany her story. Every tear becomes a symbol, not of weakness, but of the crushing burden of truth. As the scene closes, the king sits in stillness, his crown heavy not only with jewels, but with history. His eyes linger on the distance as if searching for an answer that will not come. The narration leaves viewers with a haunting promise. What Edward has said will change everything. The silence that once shielded the king has dissolved, and in its place stands a monarch in tears, facing the unrelenting weight of a past he can no longer escape. A brother's burden. For years, Prince Edward remained a quiet figure within the royal family, often overshadowed by his brothers and rarely the subject of public scrutiny. While others stepped into controversy or headline-making speeches, Edward kept his counsel, embodying discretion and restraint. To many, he seemed distant from the storms that surrounded the monarchy, a man who preferred to work in silence rather than to invite attention. Yet beneath that calm exterior, Edward carried a burden that only now, after decades, has been spoken aloud. The weight he bore was not political maneuvering nor disputes over duty. It was the voice of Diana, a voice that came to him in private moments, away from the grandeur of palace corridors and the endless scrutiny of the press. Edward reveals that Diana trusted him in ways she could not trust others. She spoke to him in confidence, seeking understanding from a brother who had no stake in power games and no desire to exploit her struggles. What she shared was not the polished image projected to the world, but the raw truth of a woman who felt trapped within the monarchy's gilded cage. Edward recalls late evenings when Diana would call, her voice trembling with frustration and loneliness. She described her sense of isolation, her fear that no one within the family truly heard her pain. These confessions were not the words of a princess basking in public adoration, but of a woman struggling to survive. The revelation casts Diana's story in a new light. For the public, she was the tragic figure adored for her grace and her humanity. For Edward, she was also a sister-in-law who quietly entrusted him with her darkest moments. He describes instances when she hinted at her fears of being erased, of becoming a shadow behind the throne. She spoke of love that felt one-sided, of battles she could never win, and of a longing for freedom that seemed forever out of reach. Each word etched itself into Edward's memory, becoming a responsibility that haunted him through the years of silence. Now that he has chosen to break that silence, Edward does not do so lightly. He admits that part of his hesitation was loyalty to his brother, loyalty to the institution, and a fear that his voice would unleash consequences he could not control. Yet as time has passed and as the weight of Diana's legacy has grown heavier with each year, he has come to believe that truth must stand above silence. His words are not intended as condemnation, but as remembrance, a testimony that Diana's cries were real and that her struggle was never imagined. Edward's burden, carried in silence for so long, is now shared with the world. It is a burden of truth that cannot be dismissed, and one that forces the monarchy to reckon with the cost of ignoring a voice that deserved to be heard. Diana's hidden pleas. Prince Edward's voice grows somber as he begins to recall the moments when Diana reached out to him in quiet desperation. To the outside world, she was the radiant princess, smiling with grace as she moved through crowds and charmed millions with her warmth. Yet Edward reveals that behind the closed doors of the palace, she lived in constant turmoil. Her cries were not always loud, but they never ceased, and they carried the unmistakable weight of a woman gasping for air within walls that allowed little room for freedom. Edward remembers the late-night phone calls most clearly. The telephone would ring long after the palace had gone still, and on the other end was Diana's trembling voice. Sometimes her words spilled out in hurried bursts, as though she feared someone nearby might overhear. At other times, her voice came slowly, heavy with fatigue, the tone of a woman who had spent the entire day holding herself together for the cameras, surrounded by people yet unseen, locked in battles within her marriage and against the institution that she knew she could not win. There were also secret notes, discreetly passed to Edward during family gatherings or sent through trusted aides. In those handwritten lines, Diana revealed her fears of being erased from history, her belief that she was cornered by forces greater than herself, and her desperate longing for someone to truly listen without judgment. Edward describes these notes not as outbursts, but as fragile cries for help, written by a woman clinging to hope while carrying a burden that was crushing her spirit. Most haunting of all were the whispered requests for help during fleeting encounters in corridors or palace gardens. Diana would lower her voice until it was barely audible, seizing the briefest moments when no one else was near. Could he speak to his brother on her behalf? Could he persuade the courtiers to ease their relentless scrutiny? Could he reassure her that she was not utterly alone in a world that treated her isolation as necessary? These whispered exchanges left indelible marks on Edward's memory, stark reminders of her vulnerability and his inability to protect her fully. The world, accustomed to the image of Diana as a beloved icon, never knew the depth of her private suffering. Edward now reveals that she confided in him more than anyone could have imagined. He became the silent witness to her torment, carrying secrets too painful to share, yet impossible to forget. Each time she reached out, he was torn between the duty imposed by the monarchy and the compassion he felt for a woman who so clearly needed more than the palace was ever willing to provide. By breaking his silence, Edward allows the world to see Diana anew. She was not only the adored princess, but also a woman whispered in the stillness of night and entrusted to him, tell a story far more human and heartbreakingly real than the fairy tale once presented to history. Charles, confronted. The revelations strike Charles with the force of a relentless wave, one he cannot resist or escape. For decades he has hidden within the routines of monarchy, burying himself in the rigid cadence of statecraft and the rituals of tradition. These duties became a shield, a carefully crafted armor that protected him from the memories he never dared to confront. Yet Edward's words cut through that armor with a sharpness that cannot be denied. The story shifts to images of Charles in his younger years. He is seen standing before advisors and courtiers, his posture straight, his voice firm, defending the image of the monarchy with unwavering conviction. His declarations were absolute. Duty must rise above private grief. Appearances must remain untarnished, and the crown must stand stronger than any single person's suffering. He was convinced that silence was strength, that emotion was weakness, and that compassion threatened the stability of the throne. In clinging to this belief, however, he overlooked the anguish that was festering within his own household. Edward's testimony pierces these memories with devastating clarity. His voice, recounting Diana's hidden pleas, forces Charles to remember every moment when she reached for him, only to encounter the cold wall of obligation. The brilliance of her public laughter is contrasted with the tears she shed behind closed doors, a haunting reminder of her loneliness. The king is left questioning whether his determination to preserve the monarchy was bought at the expense of Diana's spirit. The dignity he once believed was noble now feels hollow, a mask concealing failure, a disguise that hid the abandonment of love in favor of image. The camera lingers on Charles, capturing the weight of conscience pressing upon him. His eyes reveal the torment of a man who understands that history will not only record his reign, but will also carry the memory of the suffering endured by the woman who once shared his life. He recalls her pleas for compassion, her quiet longing for a partner rather than a sovereign, and the countless moments when he chose tradition over tenderness. Now, in the silence of reflection, he is unable to deny that his choices magnified her despair and deepened her isolation. Regret begins to settle like a shadow that clings and will not release him. No longer is he the untouchable sovereign, but a man haunted by decisions that can never be undone. The crown upon his head feels heavier than ever, not for its jewels, but for the guilt it carries. He is forced to ask whether he truly served his family with love or merely served the throne with duty. The narration underscores the weight of this reckoning. Edward's words have resurrected Diana's silenced voice, compelling Charles to acknowledge his part in her sorrow. This confrontation unfolds not in public, but within his own soul, a battlefield where no crown offers protection. In this moment, Charles stands exposed, undone by truth, bound by regret. The Palace Secrets. Prince Edward's voice grows heavier as he begins to pull back the veil on the hidden world of the palace. For decades, the monarchy projected an image of stability and unity, yet behind the grandeur of gilded halls, another reality unfolded. He describes an atmosphere thick with unspoken rules and constant surveillance, a place where every look, every gesture, and every word was measured for its potential effect on the crown. The palace was less a home than a fortress, and its walls echoed not with warmth, but with calculation. According to Edward, the power struggles within this fortress were relentless. Courtiers, advisors, and senior figures functioned as unseen players on an endless chessboard, moving with precision and silence while presenting an outward display of loyalty. Their concern was never the well-being of individuals, but the preservation of the institution itself. When Diana's struggles became visible, these figures closed ranks against her. They concluded that her openness and vulnerability were liabilities, risks to the carefully guarded facade of unity. Her candid nature threatened to reveal the fractures within, and so her voice was suppressed, her pain dismissed. Protecting the crown, they decided, meant containing her light, even if it plunged her deeper into despair. Edward recalls meetings in which Diana's name ignited tension. He remembers the coldness in the room as her tears or her honesty were dissected as problems rather than cries for help. What to others might have been signs of a woman reaching for compassion were in those rooms treated as obstacles to be managed. Every display of emotion was weighed not as human truth, but as a destabilizing force to the throne's image. The courtiers, Edward explains, were experts in quiet manipulation. They whispered to the king, to senior royals, and to the press whenever it suited their strategy. Their guiding principle was chilling in its simplicity: silence compassion in order to secure control, and truth was avoided at all costs. Within its walls, compassion struggled to breathe. Diana's yearning for understanding was met with polished smiles, rehearsed words, and whispered critiques behind closed doors. Edward admits he too felt powerless, bound by the weight of tradition, trapped in a system where speaking openly for her would be seen as betrayal. By painting this portrait, Edward exposes more than procedures and protocol. He reveals how the monarchy itself became complicit in Diana's suffering. The demand to maintain image and tradition required sacrifices, and too often the sacrifice demanded was empathy. Diana, with her open heart and defiance of silence, became the casualty of an institution that valued control over compassion. Through these revelations, Edward insists the story of Diana was never only about a marriage unraveling. It was about an institution imprisoned by its own secrecy, a fortress where love and truth struggled to survive. It was this suffocating world that shaped her tragedy and left scars that time cannot erase. A brother's anger. Prince Edward's tone shifts as he lays bare not only his memories of Diana, but also his own guilt. For years he remained silent, bound by duty and fear of disrupting the delicate balance within the monarchy. Yet silence, he admits, came at a cost. It weighed heavily on his conscience, leaving him with a sense of betrayal not only toward Diana, but also toward himself. He describes the burden of watching her struggle and knowing that his voice might have made a difference, yet choosing instead to remain in the shadows. That choice has haunted him, and now the time has come to acknowledge it. Edward recalls one particular moment that has stayed with him more vividly than any other. In the quiet of a private room, away from the eyes of courtiers and the press, he confronted Charles directly. He urged his brother to listen to Diana, to see her not as a threat to the monarchy, but as a woman in pain. He spoke with urgency, explaining that her cries for help were real and that ignoring them would have consequences no crown could hide. He hoped that as brothers they could speak honestly, that blood would outweigh duty, and that Charles would hear the warning. But Charles dismissed the plea. To him, it was another sign of distraction from the responsibilities of a future king. He told Edward that Diana was too emotional, too unpredictable, and that bending to her would place the monarchy in jeopardy. Those words left Edward stunned. He realized in that moment how far apart their perspectives had grown. What Edward saw as compassion, Charles interpreted as weakness. That memory has fueled Edward's anger for years. He admits that his frustration was not only directed at Charles, but at himself for failing to press harder, for retreating into silence rather than standing firm. He wonders whether Diana's fate might have been different had he chosen to defy the institution and side openly with her. His anger is therefore layered, both outward and inward, a reflection of a brother torn between loyalty and conscience. The revelation of this confrontation exposes fissures in the brotherly bond that the public never saw. To the outside world, Edward and Charles often appeared united, standing shoulder to shoulder at ceremonies and state events. Behind the scenes, however, cracks had already begun to spread. Trust was fragile, and the unspoken resentment between them deepened with time. Edward's anger was concealed beneath a calm exterior, but it never disappeared. It simmered quietly, waiting for the moment when truth would force it into the open. By confessing this now, Edward reveals a dynamic long hidden from public view. His anger is not expressed with rage, but with the sorrow of missed opportunities and the bitterness of knowing that silence served no one. It is a reminder that beneath the grandeur of royalty, the ties of brotherhood can fray, and when they do, the consequences echo through history. William and Harry react. The storm unleashed by Edward's testimony does not remain confined to the king. It spreads outward with relentless force, drawing William and Harry into its unforgiving path. The revelations reopen wounds that never fully healed, forcing both sons of Diana to confront the grief and betrayal that shaped their lives. Their responses, though different, reveal the contrasting ways they have carried her memory and the burdens placed upon them since childhood. The world listens intently, for in their voices the sorrow of decades is heard anew. William receives Edward's words with a stillness that unsettles those around him. His silence is not the silence of indifference, but of a controlled fury honed by years of discipline. Beneath his composed exterior lies a deep, simmering anger, the restrained rage of a son who watched his mother's cries for help go unanswered while the palace preserved its image. For William, Edward's testimony is not shocking, but a confirmation of what he always suspected. The revelation validates the truth he carried privately, now spoken aloud for the world. His fury does not erupt in shouting, but it is sharp, precise, and directed at the institution that failed her. His composure masks a determination to safeguard the monarchy's future, even as he wrestles with the injustice of its past. Harry reacts in a completely different way. His emotions pour out without restraint, his grief unshielded and raw. He declares openly that the silence of the palace nearly destroyed not only Diana, but also her sons. For him, Edward's words strike like a blade, cutting through layers of formality and tradition. They call forth memories of confusion and abandonment, of nights when he and William longed for explanations and were met only with silence. To Harry, the testimony proves that their suffering was not the imagination of children, but the result of a system that prized reputation over truth. His grief is inseparable from his anger, his voice trembling as he insists that such silence cannot continue. His words resonate with millions who see in him the courage to speak plainly where others remain bound by protocol. The reactions of the brothers ripple outward into public consciousness. Crowds gather outside royal residences with flowers, candles, and handwritten notes, scenes hauntingly reminiscent of the days after Diana's death. Media outlets replay William's quiet rage and Harry's impassioned declarations, framing them as a rebirth of Diana's legacy in the voices of her children. The grief of the people reignites with a force that feels impossible to contain. Inside the palace, the division grows sharper. William's measured fury becomes a statement of duty, a call for reform and accountability within the monarchy itself. Harry's raw emotion becomes a rallying cry for those who believe the institution has lost touch with compassion. Their voices, though different, join in exposing the wounds left unhealed by decades of silence. Through their reactions, the story of Diana transforms from memory into present reality, and the monarchy is left to face echoes of grief that time cannot erase. The media inferno. The moment Edward's revelations reached the public, the press seized them with unrelenting force. Newspapers, broadcasters, and digital outlets erupted in a frenzy, each one fighting to deliver the most sensational headline. The story carried every ingredient of irresistible drama: royal intrigue, betrayal, and long-buried truths finally unearthed. For the watching world, it was not simply another scandal, but a reckoning. Charles was painted as a monarch haunted by guilt, a man unable to escape the shadows of the past, while Edward was cast as the reluctant truth-teller who had dared to break the silence. The monarchy itself stood suddenly exposed, caught in a storm it could not control. Headlines blazed with words designed to shock and provoke. Betrayal, guilt, and redemption were splashed across front pages, demanding the reader's attention. One prominent paper declared that the king was haunted by Diana's ghost, suggesting that her presence loomed larger in death than it had in life. Another hailed Edward as the brother who finally gave voice to the silenced princess. On television screens, anchors debated heatedly, questioning whether the monarchy could withstand another storm without sustaining permanent scars. Meanwhile, social media platforms roared with commentary and speculation. Timelines flooded with archival footage of Diana's laughter, her compassion, her sorrow. Her image filled screens across the globe as though she had never left. For the monarchy, the backlash came swiftly and without mercy. Crowds gathered outside royal residences, some carrying flowers in remembrance, others waving placards demanding truth and accountability. A portion of the public called for compassion, pointing to Charles's tears as evidence of a man broken by his own regret. Yet others were unmoved, declaring that his sorrow came too late, that silence had shielded him for too long. The divide between supporters and critics widened by the hour, and the weight of Diana's memory pressed heavily upon the crown. Passing drafts back and forth, each word measured against the risk of igniting further outrage. Should the king confront Edward's testimony openly, or should he retreat into silence, hoping the tide of scandal would ebb? Every option carried peril, for the press showed no intention of letting the story fade. Reporters dug through archives, replaying old interviews and weaving them into a portrait of Diana as the people's princess, abandoned by the very institution that should have shielded her. Edward, meanwhile, became a symbol neither he nor the palace had anticipated. To others, he was a traitor, a brother who had broken faith with his family for the attention of the public. Yet his words struck too deeply to be dismissed. They gave shape to the suspicions millions already carried, and in doing so, they reignited the global fascination with Diana's life and death. The media inferno grew with every passing day. From London to New York, from Sydney to Cape Town, Diana's name was once again spoken with reverence and sorrow. Her story overshadowed the very monarch who had once shared her life. The flames of public grief and outrage burned brightly, leaving the monarchy to wonder whether it could survive the fire or whether history itself would finally consume it. The shattered silence. The story closes with the camera fixed upon King Charles, not flanked by advisors, guards, or family members, but sitting in isolation. The grandeur of the palace fades into shadows, its golden ceilings and historic portraits reduced to little more than a backdrop, to a single figure broken under the weight of memory. In this moment, there is no crown, no scepter, no illusion of invincibility. There is only a man whose shoulders slump, as though the burden of an entire dynasty has finally pressed too heavily upon him. Tears fall slowly down his face, not in ceremony or performance, but as the pure release of grief that can no longer be concealed. The silence around him is not the silence of strategy, but the silence that follows confession. Edward's words hang in the air even though his brother is no longer present. They linger like an echo in Charles's mind, circling again and again, impossible to dismiss or deny. The truth that was once contained behind palace walls has been cast into the open, no longer shielded by tradition or secrecy. Each revelation has stripped away layers of carefully crafted image, tearing at the fabric of royal mystique until only vulnerability remains. Charles sits with the knowledge that no decree, no carefully worded address, and no act of ceremony will erase what has now been spoken aloud. The truth has been etched into public memory, and with it, Diana's name is resurrected, her shadow stretching across his reign with renewed force. The monarchy itself quivers beneath the tremors of this moment. For generations, its strength had been measured not in transparency, but in silence. Silence guarded its dignity, silence smothered compassion, silence gave the illusion of unity, even when cracks ran deep. That shield has now been shattered. Edward's choice to speak has pulled back a curtain that may never again be drawn. Courtiers who once moved with quiet certainty are left scrambling, their carefully rehearsed strategies collapsing under the weight of revelations too powerful to contain. The fortress has been breached not by scandal in the press, but by truth from within. And with that truth rises the legacy of Diana, stronger and brighter than it has been in decades. Crowds across continents whisper her name, then shout it, their voices filled with sorrow, vindication, and a strange kind of triumph. They recall her laughter, her warmth, her defiance, and her pain. They see in Edward's testimony the proof of what they had long suspected, that she was more than the victim of gossip, that she was silenced within the very palace that should have protected her. Now her voice returns through her brother-in-law, carried on the breath of revelation. Charles sits still, mourning not only the woman he once loved, but the silence that destroyed her. His reign, marked by duty and struggle, will forever be entwined with her ghost. The silence that once guarded the crown has been shattered, and nothing, not even time itself, can restore it. The story closes, but the questions linger like a shadow across the crown. The silence that once guarded the palace has been torn apart, and in its place stands a raw and unflinching truth. Edward's voice has reignited a fire that cannot be smothered, pulling Diana's memory back into the heart of the nation with renewed intensity. Charles is left to face both history and himself, a king whose reign is now forever bound to the echoes of her suffering. The world watches, torn between sympathy and judgment, eager to know what comes next. Can the monarchy survive the storm? Or has Edward's confession set in motion a reckoning too powerful to contain? Stay with us, because the story of love, betrayal, and legacy is only beginning. See you next time.